Hello, I am Mitch Randall, Chief Executive Officer of Good Faith Media. Good Faith Media is a proud partner in today's webinar, Stewardship of the Earth in a Time of Crisis. The goal of today's webinar will be to fuse theology and science to address the world's existential crisis of climate change. We have two experts in their fields who will help us with that goal. Don Gordon is the founder and CEO of C3, Christians Caring for Creation. After 35 years of teaching and preaching in churches, Christian colleges, and seminaries, he has made a decision to devote the next season of his life to the care of creation. His decision was driven by recognizing that climate change is the existential challenge of our generation. He holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in mathematics at Campbell University. He did further graduate work in mathematics at NC State University. Later, he earned a Doctorate of Ministry degree from Columbia Theological Seminary, focusing on gospel and culture. Currently, Don writes and gives lectures as a professor of religion at Lenoir-Rhyne University and writes curriculum for healthcare professionals on subjects of ethics and leadership at the Healthcare Academy in Minnesota. Robert Davies is the Associate Professor of Professional Practice, Department of Physics at Utah State University. His work focuses on global environment change, sustainable human systems, and scientific storytelling for critical important stories. As a physicist, his training has been in atmospheric physics, surface physics, and quantum optics. His published scientific works are in the fields of spacecraft interaction with the space environment, the fundamental nature of light and information, and Earth's climate change. He is a leader in the Crossroads Project, which fuses original music with art, imagery, and the science to create live performance experiences that address global sustainability and provide a path towards meaningful response. Before I turn the program over to our experts, though, I want to introduce you to our interactive opportunities. First, if you would like to submit a question to one of our experts, please write out your question in the question and answer log. We will get to as many questions as possible during our Q&A times. Second, we are asking you to participate in a poll that our experts will respond to later in the webinar. Please don't forget to fill it out, as I think it will be extremely interesting to evaluate later on in the program. Again, thank you for being here and your care for our planet. Now, without further ado, let us welcome Don Gordon.
Thank you, Mitch, and all the other workers at Good Faith Media. I'm very excited to collaborate with you on this webinar. I'm also excited to partner with Robert Davies to present this fusion of science and theology to address this critical issue of our day, what I'm calling an existential challenge of our time. There is this notion that science and faith are antithetical to one another, that you can believe in science or you can believe in God, but you can't believe in both. Science and faith, however, don't need to be in conflict with one another, and we really need to be partners. 84% of the Earth's population believes in God or some higher power. And so there's a vast majority of people that are people of faith. We also need to be in partnership with the scientists, even though we are addressing different questions. The scientists address questions like like what and when and how things happen, whereas theologians and people of faith are addressing questions of who and why. And so there needs to be this partnership between science and theology. Now, for me, my reasons for getting into this have to do with my grandchildren. They are not the only reasons, but they certainly are key reasons why I'm devoting the next season of my life to these issues. The little child on the left is Tyler. She's only 3 months old. She was born in the midst of this COVID crisis. And then August is 3 years old. He's on the right. And as I reflected on their lives and what their future might be like, I really began to think about both of these children are likely to live into the 22nd century. That sort of blew my mind. I know I won't make it to the 22nd century, but actuarially, they are likely to live into the 22nd century. So what can I do for them and how can I love them well And how can I love other grandchildren around the world well? I want to do more than just attend their soccer games or their birthday parties or leave money for them from my will. Uh, I want to do something to care for their home, the only home they have, the earth. And so I would like to work for a more sustainable environment to help them have a better future. Now, where does this come from? Um, as a Christian, I want to address issues in my life and the world from a biblical perspective. And my involvement in this begins with a fundamental belief we have as Christians, and that is that the earth is the Lord's. The core of our identity in our relationship to our home, the earth, is that the earth is the Lord's. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So the earth is the Lord's. It's not mine. It's not ours. It's not the possession of any nation, any global conglomerate. It's not owned by the United States or Russia or China or by Facebook or Amazon or Google or any of these. All of it is the Lord's possession. This came to my mind as I was recently in New York City for the U.S. Open. It's been on my bucket list for a long time to go to the U.S. Open in New York. So I finally got up there for a couple of days last week, and I was able to stay in a little studio apartment that was owned by a friend of a friend who allowed me to stay there, and I paid a nominal fee, which was much lower than I would have paid if it was a normal situation. But because this was a friend of a friend, I really felt the need to take care of it and to leave it in good order, even in better order than I found it, because it wasn't mine. I had paid a small price for it, but I wanted to leave it in good shape. Well, the amazing thing about the earth is that God doesn't charge us anything to live here. We charge one another. All sorts of wars have taken place in the earth over land and oil and water and minerals, but God doesn't charge. All God asks is that we take care of it and to know upon God's return that it will be in good condition. So if I care for an Airbnb that is owned by a friend of a friend and I have to pay for it, shouldn't I care even more for the home God has provided for me for free? So that's where it all begins. Now, this psalm moves from talking about ownership of God to something regarding stewardship as well. This psalm is actually an entrance psalm. It was used by the Hebrew worshipers who would enter the temple or the tabernacle to worship God. And then when you get to verses 7 and 9, there's a really interesting, subtle move that the psalmist makes. Earlier, the psalm began with this fundamental acknowledgement of God's ownership of the earth. Everything in the earth is the Lord's. It all belongs to Yahweh, the God of Israel. But here, the Hebrew people are told to lift up the gates, and the King of glory then may come in. Now, that's an interesting phrase, may come in. Why the invitation? Isn't it all God's in the first place? Does God need permission to come into what God already owns? Well, this is referencing the paradox of ownership and stewardship. This mystery that God is the owner, God is in control, and God owns all of this, and yet God empowers us to rule, even stepping back so that we might grow in our stewardship. So this is showing us that God is not a helicopter God, not an old grandpa ready to punish us and judge us, but God is more like a parent sending their child to kindergarten, or maybe even sending the child to college, allowing the child to grow and develop and deal with all the challenges that are associated with going to a new school, relationally, academically, in every phase. God is not going to micromanage us. God owns the earth, but God makes us stewards and caretakers and gives us a lot of power in doing this. So, this stewardship idea is a very powerful commissioning that God grants. Scripture teaches this from the very beginning and shows us in Genesis 1, at the very beginning of creation, how this power is given to us. In the very first chapter of Genesis, humanity, we're told, is made in the image of God and then given this extraordinary power to rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and everything. The Hebrew word there is rada, and it means to rule, to have power, to have dominion over. It is a powerful word. The word is so powerful that this same word is used to describe what the Lord is going to do on the day of the Lord. In the Hebrew scriptures, the day of the Lord is a climatic, even apocalyptic event when God will return to rule the nations and judge the nations and exercise justice that God has intended from the outset. So it's a powerful word. The same word is used to characterize the job descriptions of the kings of Israel. Many of you, I'm sure, recall that God didn't even want Israel to have a king. God was already their king, and God knew what would happen when human kings began to exercise rada, or dominion. So many of the times rada is used in the Hebrew scriptures is as a warning for these kings and for the abuse of their power. And so this text from Ezekiel 34 is actually the last instance where the word rada is used in the Hebrew scriptures. And it is a word of warning to the kings of Israel. Woe to you, shepherds or kings of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So this power that God has given the kings and given human beings was exploited by the kings for their own gratification and their own ease, rather than using it to care for others. And unfortunately, we have exploited this same power so that we might use the earth in an exploited fashion without caring for it as we should. Now, this entire stewardship phenomenon continues from Genesis to the very end of the Bible in Revelation. This stewardship continues in the Christian narrative until the very end of time. There is a call in between Genesis and Revelation. There is this call, this time of stewardship, where we are to wait for the Lord's imminent return and work until the Lord returns. So there's this tension of waiting and working. And there are a number of parables addressing both of these. There's a parable of waiting, for example, the parable of the 10 virgins, where these 10 virgins are supposed to wait for the Lord's return, the bridegroom's return, and they're to make sure they have enough oil in their lamp to wait until the bridegroom returns. And then there's parables of working, like the parable of the talents, where the master empowers these people, these servers and workers, to work while he's gone, and he gives them talents to invest and to work while he's gone, and they are to use those to strengthen his kingdom or his land. And he admonishes them when he returns because they weren't working properly. So this waiting and working continues for us as stewards until the end. And when the end comes, there's going to be this new heaven and new earth. and which is described here in Revelation 21:1. And unfortunately, here is where some bad theology creeps in and has crept into the Christian community that has harmed the Christian community and been catastrophic for the earth. The bad theology here is that we have disconnected this earth that we live in now from this new heaven and this new earth that God is going to redeem at the end of the world. We have interpreted this verse to mean that this earth, the first earth, our earth now, and the first heaven are going to be destroyed. We've adopted this view of destruction rather than redemption. And therefore, since it's going to be destroyed, it really doesn't matter what we do to the earth, even though we have been commissioned to be good stewards of it. And so eschatology is going to shape ethics. How we view the end of the world is going to shape how we live in the world ethically now. And the scriptures teach from Genesis to Revelation that the earth one day will pass away the way our bodies pass away. Just as we are to care for our bodies because they are temples of the Holy Spirit, we are to care for the earth because it is the temple of God's presence. And we have too often abrogated our responsibility to be active stewards of the earth as if it doesn't matter, as if the only thing that matters is saving bodiless souls. So we are going to be given new bodies, and there's going to be a new earth. And in the meantime, we are to wait and work as faithful stewards for God to conclude things. Now, the Apostle Paul in Romans 8 also connects our earthly bodies with the earth itself. Both the earth and our bodies have been under this curse since the fall of creation in Genesis chapter 3. But then Paul says in Romans 8:20, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into freedom and glory of the children of God. Our bodies and our earth, Paul is saying, are waiting for the same thing. They're waiting to be liberated. They're waiting to be redeemed. They're waiting to be set free, not destroyed, not obliterated. So the creation will be liberated from decay, just as our bodies are going to be liberated from decay. So this earth is not going to be thrown away. It's going to be renewed. It's going to be renovated. It's going to be reclaimed. It's going to be redeemed. Now, in the meantime, because of the fall and its current frustration, there is this frustration and this groaning that is taking place in our time. And so this is where Robert Davies, is going to talk about some of the earth's groanings in just a moment. But I'm going to stop at this point, and we can take questions.
Don, thank you so much. That was very enlightening. Appreciate you laying the theological framework and foundation for this important discussion. I want to remind our participants to ask their questions in the Q&A module that is provided for you during this webinar. I know Don and Robert would love to answer any questions that you might have. But Don, as you were talking there for just a moment, you brought up the Genesis narrative, and that's just so fascinating to me because, in the first two chapters of Genesis, you have this moment where God is creating, and we have this symbiotic relationship between humanity and all else that God has created. And then in your lecture, you moved us from the creation of the first two chapters into the fall narrative in chapter 3. There appears and seems to be this moment where humanity moves from this symbiotic understanding of existence within God's creation to this moment of devouring or dominating God's creation when the fruit is taken in. Um, do you see the first three chapters of Genesis really demonstrating the human mindset when it comes to relating to God's creation and to each other?
I do think it really comes back to that misuse or abuse of this power that God has given us, this rada, this power to rule and this power to have dominion over things. And we have misused that and abused. And just the little story of uh, Adam and Eve taking this fruit that was not theirs to take. They were provided some limitations, some boundaries as to what they could and could not take. And we really could take that story and sort of create a macro story from it, to see how that abuse of taking that fruit that was not meant for us was taken as a metaphor for taking all these things that are beyond what we should be taking, exploiting the earth in so many different ways, going beyond the boundaries that God has given us, which has caused problems with us, with one another, with human beings fighting one another for this material, these minerals, these fruits, as well as our relationship with God that's damaged that and estranged us from God. So it is, I think, relevant to what we're dealing with in our time.
And as a person of faith, I think a lot of times we often forget that the world, this globe that we dwell upon, is a living being. God created it. It is a created being by the divine. Urian Maltman, a great theologian, talked about this in one of his books, that humanity must never forget that they dwell within this ecological symbiotic existence with the world, and that the world, the planet itself, is a living, breathing organism. And when living, breathing organisms are attacked, such as is under attack now with climate change and all the fossil fuels that we are distributing into the air, that a living organism reacts to survive. And climate change is the Earth's ability or a defense mechanism to survive upon the attack that it's receiving. Would you agree with what Maltman's saying there?
Oh, absolutely. And I think is for those who are interested in doing a Bible study, you might want to do a survey of the scriptures to see how often the scriptures are communicating. I mean, excuse me, how often the creation or the earth and everything in the earth is communicating to us and around us. So, for example, when Job is defending himself against his detractors, he says, "Go to the animals. They will tell you that I'm innocent." And so that's just one little example of things in scripture that indicate that the other parts of creation are living and they are a part of God's loving plan. And we're to be in relation with all of them, not just one another.
And we do have a question from the audience. The question is this: what do you, or what do you think, or what do you think the main reason that many evangelical Christians do not embrace science and the importance of caring for the planet?
I think that there is um, a fear among some Christians that um, that science um, is going to usurp their understanding of God and the world and explain it so thoroughly and completely that there will be no room left for God. I think that's part of the reason. Part of the reason is we've had some bad theology that has separated us from the scientific community. And I think we're in a period now where that is evident in a number of ways. But the Christian community, in some of its previous eras, has had great scientists who have also been faithful theologians and Christians within the church. So I think that those are a couple of reasons why so too many Christians separate science and faith.
Hmm. Well, Don, thank you so much for those answers. I want to thank our participants for asking those questions. Please keep those questions coming when Robert Davies comes on here in just a second. If you haven't filled out our poll, make certain that you provide answers to the poll. We would love to hear from you. And then after Dr. Davies' presentation, I'll bring both of our guests or both of our experts back to talk about the poll and evaluate the answers. Now, let's listen to Dr. Robert Davies, who's an associate professor of professional practice at the Utah State University. Welcome, Dr. Davies.
Well, thank you very much, Mitch, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank Don for putting together this webinar and reaching out to his community and for inviting me to be a part of it. So thank you very much. As I've been presented to you, I am a scientist and I study, among many things, climate change as it fits into this much larger picture of global change. I'm going to use this word rather than change of disruption, because when things change very quickly, we often think of them as abruptly. And certainly here on the planet, the climate is changing very rapidly, so much so that it is disrupting both natural and human systems. So that's what we're here to discuss, is just what is it we know from this enterprise of science about this phenomenon of climate change. And I'm going to assume that most of you who are listening have a pretty good sense of the basic story of climate change. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it, but I do want to review very briefly. And it's worth just taking a moment to look at it. So this is what global warming looks like from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th to today. Now, this map shows temperature change on the planet, not temperature. So the high northern latitudes, the North Pole up there, didn't suddenly get warmer than the equator, but it's warming up faster. So as the different locations went from the cooler blues to the warmer reds, that's those places warming up. I'm going to show it to you one more time. End of the 19th century, temperature change to the middle of the 20th to today. And you can see that this warming is definitely not uniform around the planet. There's lots of detail in here, which we find fascinating to study. But if you average the whole planet together, we find that over the last century or so, we've warmed a little more than 1 degree Celsius. For those of you who are metrically challenged, I understand. So you can always convert a temperature change, not temperature, but temperature change from Celsius to Fahrenheit by roughly doubling it. So that's about 2 degree Fahrenheit change. And it doesn't seem like much. I'm going to put that in context in a moment. But that's just the global warming. That's what we're talking about. So there are 4 things that we know with very high confidence scientifically that are relevant to our discussion today. The first one is that the planet is warming globally, which we've just looked at. Now, the second thing we know with high confidence is that it is because of us. This global warming is anthropogenic. It is human-caused, principally from the burning of fossil fuels. That's because carbon dioxide, which is a result, is a greenhouse gas, and we understand the physics of this extremely well. Because of its molecular structure, it traps energy that is leaving the Earth in the form of light, infrared light, and converts that energy into thermal energy in the atmosphere and a whole planetary system. And the physics equation that tells us that a molecule of carbon dioxide will do this is the exact same equation that makes all of our solid state electronics possible. Not a version of it, but the exact same equation. So we understand this physics really well. The third thing we know with very high scientific confidence is that this anthropogenic global warming, this human-caused global warming, is disrupting the entire planetary climate system. And that's because, of course, everything in this closed system is connected. So when you change the temperature of the planetary system, you change everything else about the environment. And that is what we mean then by climate change. And it's happening so rapidly that it's really a climate disruption. And there is one more thing that we know with extreme confidence scientifically that is relevant to this discussion, where we're going to spend our time the next 20 minutes or so. And that is, on our path, if we continue on this path for very much longer, it carries with it extreme risks for humans. And that's what we're going to spend our time on. These four things are considered scientific knowledge. And I want to be clear what we mean by that in science. When we say we know something, what we mean is that these conclusions are consistent with many independent lines of evidence, like lots of witnesses to an event telling essentially the same story, and inconsistent with no lines of evidence. So everything we have, and it's a lots of different lines of evidence, point to this as knowledge. So this is what we know. Now, I suspect most of you understood this to some degree or another before the webinar today. But if you still have questions about the basic science of these conclusions, I know I know Don on his website has posted a link to a series of 5-minute lectures that I give on the basic physics of climate change. And so you should feel free to go and have a look at that. I'd love it if you did. But for the moment, for the rest of today's discussion, let's take these as our baseline of knowledge and move forward from there. What makes sense as a means of response if we accept these things as true? Now, the answer to that is that it kind of depends on what we mean by extreme risks for humans and how seriously we take that. So what I want to do is talk to you about the scale of both the risk that we're facing and the scale of the response that is going to be necessary for us to mitigate this risk, should we decide. So what scientists do is to look at the changes that we've seen for the warming that we've already had, for the amount of carbon that we've already thrown into the atmosphere, and try to build models. And these models are mathematical models, the physics, just applying physics to the climate system, and project under different scenarios where we think things will go. So for example, here's a projection of temperature change across North America this century. And again, as we move to the warmer reds, that's those places warming up. And this is under a high carbon emissions pathway. This is the pathway that we are currently following, where we're continuing to throw enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And when we look at this, we're going to look at two scenarios, really. The scenario on the right is a high carbon scenario. That's an additional 13 degrees Fahrenheit of warming by the end of this century, should we continue on our current path, which, by the way, we have shown no real signs of deviating from. The scenario on the left is under a low carbon emission scenario. If we sort of, in the context of this presentation, get religion, so to speak, right away and move dramatically and quickly to a low carbon scenario, we can still expect by the end of the century significant additional warming, about as much as we've already had. But these are two very different scenarios, and I want us to look at these scenarios as a choice. We are choosing every day whether or not to move on the scenario on the right or the scenario on the left. Now, I'll tell you that the people who study these, from societal planners to defense planners to ecologists, biologists, sociologists, you name it, refer to the scenario on the right as catastrophic. And we use that term fairly precisely, meaning unadaptable by human civilization. We often hear the term save the planet. But I want to assure everybody that this planet's been here for 5 billion years, and it's going to be here for another 5 billion or so more. And the planet will be just fine. This is about save the people and save the creatures that the people depend upon. And on the scenario on the right, neither our biosphere nor our human civilization is adaptable to these changes at the rate that it's happening. The scenario on the left is regarded as dangerous and significant, but with large effort and with dedication, we can hopefully adapt to this and still make it a place where we can thrive. So this is one example of just the temperature projections. Let me show you another example. Where I live in Utah, snowpack is incredibly important. And what I'm showing you is spring snowpack in the mountains. So what we're looking at here is the Rocky Mountains, where the colors are blue in the spring. We have our deepest snowpack, that's the high elevations, and where they're white, that's the thinning snowpack as we get down into the lower elevations. And most of us here in the West get most of our water from melting snowpack. It's at its thickest at the end of the winter and the beginning of the spring, and then it starts to melt. And let's just take a look what we expect to happen to that snowpack over the next 80 years or so on our current trajectory. Again, a high carbon scenario. So I'm going to show you observations of that depth of that snowpack in the spring, starting in 1950, and then we'll move forward into projections. So as you can see, some years as we move through this animation are snowier than others. The snowpack is a little deeper or a little thinner, but we always have substantial snowpack, and that's what gives us our water. As we move towards mid-century, however, we see the snowpack dramatically thinning under a high carbon scenario, which we're currently following. And by the end of the century, we see we have essentially no snowpack at all. This is easy to understand. As we move from get to a warmer climate, more of our precipitation comes as rain instead of snow. And so this huge snow reservoir that we have in the mountains goes away. Now, I want to point out that under this high carbon scenario, both for the snowpack that I just showed you and for the temperature projections I showed you before, there is one very important difference between the low carbon and the high carbon scenario, one additional difference. And that is, under a high carbon scenario, this is not where we expect climate to stop changing. It's just where we've stopped the simulations. Under a high carbon scenario, we expect the change to continue for another couple of centuries. And I'm going to give you a sense of that in just a moment. I want to show you one more projection. This is for soil moisture, of course, incredibly important for recharging aquifers and for vegetation, both for ecological systems and for our agricultural systems. This is a moderate carbon emissions scenario projection as the different places on the map go from the drier browns, let me rephrase that. As the different places on the map get browner, they're getting drier. As they get bluer, they're getting wetter. So let's start the projections starting now. As we go through mid-century, you see significant drying through the middle of the century, but then under a moderate carbon emissions scenario, as we move to the end of the century, things start to level off. We've seen as much change as we're going to get. We have to adapt to this. But now let's compare that to a high carbon scenario, which we're currently on. Again, significant drying through the middle of the century for most of North America, and then dramatically enhanced drying through the end of the century. And again, under a high carbon scenario, this is not where that ends. It's just where we'd end the projections. Now, I haven't given you any numbers, but I'm just going to tell you once again that the people who study the implications of these changes, again, tell us that the scenario on the right is catastrophic, and the scenario on the left is dangerous but adaptable. Again, catastrophic being used precisely as we can scientifically to mean unadaptable by our human systems. And of course, it's not just the very obvious things of temperature and precipitation. Let's take a look at, I've said that I've used this term catastrophic. Let me give you another example of the kinds of changes that we're looking at this century. And we're going to do that by connecting the dots on this graphic. These dots represent population centers around the world on coastlines of 1 million people or more. On our current trajectory, by the end of this century, and this is not where it stops, but just by the end of the century, we can expect about 2 meters or 6 feet or so of sea level rise. That will displace directly 200 million people across the planet, depriving them of their homes and their livelihoods, and annually flood, as a result of storm surges and high tides, an additional 600 million people around the planet. And it's projections like this that, for example, that have led the United States Department of Defense to call climate change the single largest security risk to the United States, because now think of what has been happening across the Middle East and North Africa over the past decade, as several million people have been displaced from their homes, both from environmental changes in North Africa, much less predictable weather that is causing crops to fail, and let's think of Syria, where an intense drought over 4 years drove millions of people into the cities, the population centers, in a society that was already stressed, collapsing the entire country into civil war, displacing 5 million people from their homes. And as those people try to make their way, and a few million have tried to come to Europe, and think of how politically destabilizing that has been across Europe and globally. And now, instead of thinking of 2 or 3 or 4 million people, think of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people displaced in this same way. And you start to see the level of the knock-on effects of this disruption. So it's projections like this and this and this that have led the very broad spectrum of scientists and large community of scientists and social planners who study these things to make statements like this. And this is Kevin Anderson, director of the Tyndall Climate Center in the United Kingdom. Kevin is a carbon modeler. He looks at different scenarios moving forward. And what he means by this statement, what he means by a 4-degree future, is 4 degrees Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial average temperature, of which we've already warmed a little more than 1 degree. Incompatible with an organized global community, likely to go beyond adaptation, this is the catastrophic bit, and devastating to a majority of ecosystems. Now, he goes on to say there's a high probability of not being stable, and I want to talk to you about what that means. The notion is that the climate system is a complex system, and it behaves in a twitchy fashion. It means you can push it a little and it changes a little, push it a little and it changes a little bit, or you push it a little bit too much, it can change dramatically. And we know that complex natural systems behave this way. This is a graph of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. You can see for the last 1,000 years, it's been around this level of 280 parts per million, 280 carbon dioxide molecules for every million other molecules. In fact, it's been this way for the last 12,000 years since we came out of the last ice age. Starting in the Industrial Revolution here in the 18th and early 19th century, we start to climb as we burn more fossil fuels. And then here in the middle of the 20th century, it shoots up dramatically to where we are today. And this should actually be 417 parts per million. And by studying past climate data, we see that, in fact, the last time the Earth was above about 350 parts per million for very long, let's call it a century or two, geologically speaking, this planet was ice-free and the oceans were a couple of 100 feet higher. So this is something we call a tipping point or a threshold. And there are actually a number of these, a couple of dozen that scientists have identified as probable tipping points or thresholds in this twitchy behavior of our climate system. So this notion of instability is often described physically by imagining a system that is just a marble in a little dimple. And if we disturb that marble a little bit, the conditions around it in that dimple tend to take it back to where it was. But if we disturb that marble just a little too much and it crosses over this shoulder, this threshold, this tipping point, then the conditions change such that they no longer try to take it back to where it was, but they accelerate it away from where it was into a dramatically different state. And we know that our climate system behaves this way. In fact, it's the story of the last several million years of glacial and interglacial cycles, ice ages, and then interglacial periods like we're in now. So if you think of this large blue dimple here as an ice age, we have been spending most of our time for the last several million years in ice ages that last 100, 120,000 years. Then we pop up into a little warm period for 15,000 years or so, and then drop back down into an ice age. And this is very twitchy behavior. There are thresholds that cause this to happen, and we understand this behavior quite well. So this is a picture of our current situation. We are in our interglacial period. For the last 12,000 years, we've been dragging along, but just recently, we've pushed ourselves out of this dimple into kind of this little no man's land, so to speak. And very soon, we're likely going to cross thresholds that will take us into a very, very different state. Sometimes we call this the hothouse Earth. And of course, we don't want to do that. We want to move ourselves back into this nice stabilized system in which human civilization evolved. So we humans are extremely adaptable. We can live in all kinds of dramatically and intensely different climates. But human civilization, on the other hand, is very finely tuned to the climate in which it has evolved over the last 10,000 years, the whole time we've been in this warm interglacial period. Again, think of the population centers on very stable coastlines. Think of where we grow our food and how we get our water, how we've organized ourselves, very sensitive to this set of climatic conditions that we're in. And our task then is to make sure we keep ourselves in that. So hopefully this makes it clear that as we look at the dramatic changes unfolding around us, the heat waves, the intense precipitation events, the enormous fires that are not simply confined to California, but are global, Australia, Siberia, et cetera, Greece, Europe. When the media refers to this as the new normal, hopefully this makes it clear that we are nowhere close to the new normal. And that is the kind of thing that people like Kevin Anderson, and in fact, the mainstream scientific community means when we say that we are in a climate emergency. An emergency is a situation that requires an immediate response to prevent catastrophic outcomes. And that is precisely technically correct to describe the situation that we're in. Now, I want to take a moment. I've kind of blasted through this information and I've done it rather clinically. But if you're taking in what I'm telling you, I suspect the scale of the risk that we're facing is much larger than many of you understood. And it's a very difficult message to take in. In fact, it's very emotional for many people. Don is very right to be extremely worried for the future of his grandchildren, although it's not limited to future generations. I will say that climate change has already been catastrophic for some people in some places on this planet. There is no fixing climate change. We're going to lose a lot more. But the point of inspiration is that there's so much that can still be saved if we choose the path that will take us there. So I want to tell you now about the scale of the response that is required if we are to save what can still be saved. And the basic physics equation here is this: more carbon is more risk. We don't know exactly where these thresholds are, but we know that they're probably there, and lots of evidence tells us that we're very, very close. So what this means is if we can calculate if we can decide on some kind of danger line, then we can calculate how much more carbon do we think we can throw up in the atmosphere and still stay below those thresholds. This has been done. We call it a carbon budget. 2 degrees Celsius was our danger line, has been assumed to be our danger line for the last 20 or 30 years or so. And this is our budget as of about a decade ago, 1,000 billion tons, gigatons of carbon dioxide. Now, since that time, 2 things have happened. We've burned through a lot of our budget, and we've changed the danger line to 1.5 degrees because it turns out the impacts to human civilization and to natural systems have been much bigger than were originally thought would be the case for the amount of warming that we've had. And here is how fast we are going to burn through this budget. Less than a decade. This is very easy to calculate. And when you hear people say, well, we have a decade to deal with climate change, this is what they're talking about. But they get the story wrong, because the story is this: we don't have a decade to deal with climate change. We're out of time. We need to be making big moves right now. This is that budget relative to the coal and oil and natural gas that we are currently excavating by traditional means. In other words, less than 10% of the coal and oil and natural gas that we're already excavating can we actually burn, according to this budget. And if we include things like tar sands and fracking, of course, the reserves are much bigger, and the science tells us that we can only burn about 5% of that. Now, this isn't liberal or conservative. It's not Republican or Democratic. It's simply physics. So if we are to do this, if we are to not burn through that budget, what does that look like for us? Well, these are our carbon emissions from all of human civilizations going back to 1990. Over here on the left, this is how many billions of tons of carbon dioxide have we thrown up into the atmosphere. So 20 billion tons back in 1990, about 40 billion tons last year. And this is what needs to happen if we are to meet that budget. We need to peak, we need to do it right now, and then we need to decline to zero no later than the middle of this century. And that needs to get underway in a big way this decade. The next 5 years, the next 10 years are the most important any of us will ever live through. This is a rational decarbonization, a decoupling of our civilization from carbon emissions. If you integrate under that curve, that's our budget. And if we don't peak now, but we wait a little bit longer to peak, that means that we burn more of that budget up front and we need to make it up on the back end. That means that every year we delay, it gets much harder to meet this budget. If we are to meet this budget, what does that look like? Basically, it means we need to cut our emissions in half every decade for the next 30 or 40 years. And this first decade is by far the most important. That means a 7% annual decline globally. We've never come anywhere close to doing anything like that. And now it's important to understand one more aspect of what this means for us here, those of us on the call and those of us here in this country, because not everybody is equally responsible for the problem that we have and for continuing this problem. Around the globe, about 10% of the world's population are responsible for about 50% of our emissions. If the top 10%, if these top 10% of the world's emitters would simply cut their emissions to the average European, so this is not ascetic, this is not massive deprivation, just the average European lifestyle, that would already reduce our emissions by a third. And so this, you can see that from a sort of equity and social justice standpoint, and simply from a capability standpoint, it's the top 10% of the world's emitters that have the most leverage to pull. These are the people with the means to cut their emissions. The top 20% of the planet, and that includes all of us on this webinar today, are responsible for 80% of the world's emissions. If the top 1% of the emitters in the United States, that's 3.5 million people, are responsible for 2,500 times as much emissions as the bottom 1% in the world. In other words, these 3.5 million in the United States would equal about 188 billion of these people. That's 27 times the world's population. So again, the responsibility for this predicament we're in is not equally distributed, and the means by which we can meaningfully address it is also not evenly distributed. It's those of us at the top that have the biggest levers to pull. So what this 7% annual decline means really is a 15% annual decline for those of us in that top 20% in the developed world. We need to bend the emissions curve now. We need to cut our emissions every decade, 15% per year for those of us in the developed world. And this is applicable on any scale. And this is where I want to conclude, because often the question, hopefully, that's running through carrying people's minds is, what do I do? So what do you do? There are three things that you can do immediately. The first one where our minds immediately go is personal change. Can you cut your emissions this year 15%? For most of us, that's fairly trivial. We can do it. Can you eat 15% less meat, 15% less driving, 15% less flying? It's almost trivial for most of us. But then you have to do it again next year, and you have to do it again next year. And it gets harder and harder because the systems that we are embedded in fight us. So I'm going to get to that. So you can minimize your footprint at home and at work, but that only takes us so far. You can talk about these changes to get to normalize these conversations and these changes, both at home and at work. But the biggest lever is societal change. We have to transform our systems of food and energy, and most of all, economy, from which this crisis is emerging. We have to engage politically to push for better policies. And this is where most of us get pushed out of our comfort zones. Now, if you only want to do one or two of these, let's take a look at the weakness of that. So if you only do personal change and talk about it, that's good, but it's only got minimal impact and it's very local. It's missing that critical system change. If you do personal change and societal change, that's great, but there's no amplification because your voice is not bringing other people along. If you only talk about it and work for societal change, you tend to lose credibility because you're not living your principles. You're not taking ownership of the problem. And so the maximum impact is if you make personal changes, if you talk about those changes and you work for social change as well. And I'm going to conclude with just one remark on this notion of mindset. I'm going to skip over this gentleman who, of course, guided the Western world through World War II. We often talk about when the changes are this big and this dramatic and the risks are huge, this hope and despair framework. And I simply want to tell you that in an emergency, hope and despair is not the right framework. You don't hope that you get out of a burning house. You just get out, or you die trying. And you don't despair that you can't. You identify another step and you take it, and you identify another step and you take it. This is our task. We all want hope, and what I've just told you is a story of incredible risk and very difficult response. I'll tell you that we have the technology we need to do this. We don't need one single bit more of science or technology. We have what we need. This is now almost entirely a cultural challenge. And that's where I think your community of faith can really punch above its weight. It's about transforming our approach to how we live on this planet. It is critically important that we do that. Without that, we cannot get to where we're going. On the eve of World War II, when the British were about to lose their entire expeditionary force in Europe in the spring of 1940, they were trapped on Dunkirk. Churchill couldn't get the United States involved, and it was utterly hopeless for Great Britain in this hope-despair framework. And this is when he got on the radio and gave his famous speech, "We shall fight them on the mountains, and we shall fight them in the landing fields, and we shall fight them in the hills and in the streets, and we shall never surrender. And we shall never surrender, and we shall never surrender." If you listen to that speech and fully understand the context in which it was being delivered, in the hope-despair framework, this was a hopeless time, but this was not a man in despair. This was a man full of resolve. Find the next step and take it. Find the next step and take it. And that is where our mind has to be. So I want to thank you all very much for your attention. Don, once again, for the invitation to present this information to you, and make one more statement of asking really for your forgiveness in one sense. The information I presented is difficult and it's shocking to many. I can simply tell you that this is where we are. And our task right now is not to be in despair. Our task is to be full of resolve, to meet this challenge, to find the next steps and to take them. And I understand the role of hope, but if you want hope, understand this: hope is not free. If you want hope, act. It is action that generates hope, not the other way around.
Professor Davies, thank you so much. That information was eye-opening, insightful, and certainly challenging as we face this crisis together as a people of the human race. So thank you so much for your presentation. We've got a few questions from the audience that I think are important for us to address at this time. The first is looking at the information that the professor provided for us. There's a lot of skepticism in the world these days. It seems as though everything is politicized. You would think that with the world facing a global pandemic, that would not be politicized, but it has been. And this is where we are in the world. It seems as though the question is coming from the vantage point that, do you have any sense that we can eventually come together in this moment of crises to really practically address the issue of climate change? Professor Davies?
That's a wonderful question, and of course, it's what we all think of. And I'm going to refer to the words of Wendell Berry, just one of America's treasures, a poet and gentleman farmer from Kentucky, and ecologist and naturalist, who, when asked this question, "Do you think we can meet this challenge?" answered with, "I don't feel like I have the right to ask that question." And I interpret that answer as the following way: the problem with the question of, can we do this? Can we come together? Can we get ourselves to do this? The problem with that question is it is unanswerable a priori. We don't know, and there's certainly many reasons to be pessimistic about the answer, right? To think that we can't. We don't know. But in the absence of incontrovertible evidence that we can't, I believe our task is to not worry about that question. It's not a useful question because it is unanswerable. Our task is to assume that we can do this. And if we are to do it, to identify next steps. We're climbing a mountain, we can't see the entire path all the way to the top, but we can see next steps. And I will simply add that we have roadmaps. We know how to transform our food system. We know how to transform our energy system. We know how to transform our economic system. The question is, can we get ourselves to do that? And this is where your community of faith is so incredibly important. It's not going to be scientists like me telling the story. We've been doing it for decades. I've personally been doing this for 15 years. It's time for you all to take over and take responsibility for moving your community to a place of meaningful response, to genuine cultural transformation. This is simply what is required, and far more than the scientific community. It's communities like yours that are going to get us there if we are to get there.
And Reverend Gordon, we've got another question just about practical ways that we can engage in this conversation. Again, everything seems unfortunately to be so politicized and so confrontational. Can you provide us some really good practical ways that we can engage with those who may be skeptical about climate change and what we can do to bring us back to a point of sustainability?
If we could put up the slide that has our website on there, I would like to reference that and let people know what our website is, because on the website, if you go to our resources page, there is going to be a way for people to engage in what we're calling a C3 certification program. And it's for churches and businesses and individuals to create a system of accountability. And we actually have put a number of things on there regarding our personal lifestyle, facilities, things that you can do in your church, studies, conversations you can have that can help us take steps and not just talk about this. But so I want to invite you to look at that website and go to our resources page to learn about the C3 certification process. In terms of the faith community, what is going to be effective in our communities is to recognize and to do not political studies, but theological and biblical studies. Because I think if we delve into the Bible and delve into the history of the church's study of theology, we will see more than enough resources to help us and guide us in being faithful stewards of the earth. So I think we do have to find ways to depoliticize this, and that is not to try to convert people into our political system, but for us in our community to go to the scriptures and try to really see what they are saying to us about faithful stewardship. So that would be my response to the depoliticization that we need to have now.
Thank you, Don. We've run a little bit over time today, but I do think it's important for us to get to the survey. We want to thank all of our participants who filled out our questionnaire and poll. So yes, there it is right there. Let's just work through that and get your response. The first question of our poll was, have you heard or preached a sermon about creation care in the last year? 52% of our respondents said yes, with 48% saying no. What is your response to that, Don?
I'll be honest with you, I'm pleasantly surprised with that, because most of the churches that I know about do not address this and have not preached a sermon about it and have not dealt with this in any way. So Robert and I were talking about this last night prior to this, thinking that we may be preaching to the choir today, because the people who would come to this kind of seminar are already interested in this and maybe in churches where this is more of a normative thing. And so I'm pleasantly surprised by that. But what Robert is saying, and what we're trying to do, is for all Christian communities to hear sermons on this, to be engaged in studies on this and conversations about this, and then to lead their people to practical application of this in society and politics, in their lifestyle, every phase. So I certainly hope that number can go up to 100% when we do something like this again.
Good. And talking about those practical opportunities, question number two is, does your church, business, or nonprofit have a creation care team? 10% only answered in the affirmative, with 90% saying no, their organization does not have a climate or a creation care team. Professor Davies, you talked about in your presentation the importance of some of these practical aspects or opportunities that we can engage in. This seems to be one of the opportunities that people could really make a big difference in. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. Let me say that if we are to meet this challenge, there is no question that this requires a mass mobilization of our entire society. And let me take it back to those three things that we talked about: sort of the personal, and then the talking about it, and then the societal change. Mobilizing our entire society means talking about it. Normalizing this conversation. Imagine if this were December 8th, 1941, and no one was talking about Pearl Harbor. Hard to mobilize an entire nation to do what we did under those conditions, but of course that's not what happened. So mobilizing all of us requires that we talk about it, and as we talk about it, I have consulted with a number of businesses through my role at Utah State University, who are now seeking us out, who essentially want to create such organizations they want their businesses to be doing what they can from within the scope of as architects, or as restaurants, or as financial planning firms, or as banks. I've talked and dealt with all of them. What can we be doing? How should we be reorganizing? What kind of a planet should we be preparing ourselves for and helping to create? So these, what you are terming creation care teams, I think will go by different names, of course, whether it's a faith-based organization or a business, but they're becoming more and more prevalent as more and more people start to understand the risks and say, how can we be a part of that solution? So this is absolutely critical that we be addressing this from within certainly our places of worship, but also our businesses, to make it our basically core mission to meet this challenge. Because if we do not, everything else takes a second seat. Yeah.
Mitch, I would add to
Well said.
that. I don't know if you can hear me now, but I would just add very quickly to that I am hoping that the faith-based communities, and particularly our faith tradition, the Christian community, can go to the forefront of this and not be trailing along behind everybody else, but we can get in front and be the ones that are leading and offering guidance on this and inspiration on this. So we did that with orphanages and abolition and hospitals and universities, and so we have to do it for this.
I will make one more comment too. There is a scientist. I'm sure many on this webinar are familiar with her. Her name is Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. She's at Texas Tech University. She's a first-rate heavy hitter climate scientist, but also evangelical Christian. And she in particular has spoken quite eloquently about her perspective as a scientist and how the evangelical Christian community, from her perspective, can specifically can be responding. And so you may want to look her up, Katharine Hayhoe, Hayhoe. Lots of videos, lots of articles, that sort of thing. She's a wonderful, I think, resource for the evangelical community.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate that. Third question is really want to get both of your response, and that is, who will be the most positive influence on matters of creation care? 33% said scientists, 19% said clergy, 29% said media personalities, and 19% said other individuals would be more influential. So what is your response to that? Scientists, clergy, media personalities, who's going to sway the biggest stick when it comes to climate care matters?
Well, I'll just, I don't know who's the most influential, but I'm going to actually challenge the framing of the question. And my experience is that it's not about who's most influential. It's about all of us doing our bit. We exist in an ecosystem of messaging and an ecosystem of response. I think scientists are influential for some demographics and faith leaders for other demographics, media personalities for other demographics. It's not which of us is most important. It's the fact that we all need to be working together synergistically, to use a physics terms, coherently, such that our efforts overlap and amplify each other. We all need to be doing our bit. And I don't know that there's really any one single most influential group.
Don, were you surprised that clergy were less influential in the survey, at least, than scientists?
No, I wasn't surprised by that. I think that the default for that would often be our scientists know so much about this and are going to be able to provide the data we need. But as Robert has said, and since I've been immersed in this over the past couple of years, I am increasingly aware that the science, we have more than enough science to act. And so now it's a time of the will and mobilizing people. And so we all are going to need to act and to move and move into this period of change and prepare people for change and call people to change. And the clergy are going to have to be involved in this. You know, again, 84% of the world believes in God and some higher being, and that's a large percentage of people, and they're going to need to be mobilized within their particular faith traditions to address this.
Just briefly, I might add that, and I know this is a different group than yours, but of course, certainly synergistically related. Pope Francis has issued, this encyclical a few years ago, Laudato Si, which is his call on the Catholic community and the world to act as stewards of the planet and to meaningfully meet the challenge of climate change, along with this whole suite of ecological and social crises that we're facing, particularly being hyper inequity on the planet as well. And if you haven't read that, I think it's well worth the read. It's not that long. Laudato Si is the name, the encyclical from the Catholic Church of a few years ago on this very topic.
Thank you for noting that. And one of the big things that we hear at Good Faith Media a lot is that people of faith often like to talk about these issues, but don't like to engage in the practicality to bring these issues to the forefront and act upon them. And that's what organizations like C3 are doing. Professor, you're doing that as well. And the final question of the survey was, what do you want to see in future C3 webinars? And it was overwhelmingly suggested practical ways that people can take care of this planet. And so hopefully Don and Robert will go back to the drawing board, continue building future webinars with all of this great information that you have provided to us. We want to thank all of our participants for filling out the poll. We really, really appreciate you doing that for us. Well, I'm going to give both of our experts the final word. So Professor, let's begin with you. And what is your final word for our audience today?
Well, on the note that you just left with, the notion of what are practical things that you can do, part of the problem with designing a webinar or any kind of an hour-long lecture on that kind of a notion is there are so many. And the answer really comes down to who are you and what are your talents and what are your interests and what are your means. And so I'm going to throw that right back to the respondents who are here and say, we all know how to get online and start doing the search. I think what we can do mostly is try to motivate you with the basic knowledge that we've been trying to do. And certainly, I'm very happy to talk about specifics on all kinds of things, but it's different for whoever you are. Certainly there are those personal changes, but we must move beyond that. This has to be happening from within our professional lives as well. So if you're an architect or a chef or a farmer or a banker or a financier or an artist, storytelling is enormously important. Think of, the social changes of the 1960s, it wasn't Berkeley sociologists who were connecting us to those. It was 19-year-old musicians and writers and filmmakers telling those stories in ways that we could connect to and then respond to as a society. So whoever you are, whatever your means and your talents and your interests, there is a role for you, but I'm going to throw it back on you and say, now it's time for you to figure out what that role is and what you can do.
Thanks, Professor. And Don, before we get to you, we've got a sponsor for today's webinar that you may want to mention.
I just want to thank Sean Fenton, who has been a key sponsor for this. He has made this possible to some degree. So I wanted to introduce him to you. We certainly still are in need of support, financial support for this event and future events. And so if you would be willing to go to our website and go to our donation page, we really could use your support. And once again, to reference some practical things, I want to direct you to our resources page on that. Actually, I put some practical things here, and the top one is become a C3 certified church or a business or an individual. And you can go to our resource page, and there's lots of practical things that you can do to make that happen. The next thing is to create a creation care committee so that you can mobilize your church and your people to do that. And you can see other small things that we can do. But the big thing is for all of us to do our part to invite other people to join us, because this is a global crisis that needs a global response.
Thank you, Don. We really appreciate that. And to all of our attendees today, we want to thank you for being with us. It's been extraordinarily informative. Don, Robert, thank you so much for your expertise and what you're doing to inspire us to care for the planet.